Hello, my friends. How are you today? Hope you're doing well and having a great day. It's hard for me to believe that we're already in October and that this year has just zipped by so fast. But because it's October, I thought it'd be kind of fun to talk about something that's a little bit creepy, but also grounded in logic, grounded in some research, and just grounded for the election season we're upon at this time. So today we're going to talk about the rise of the Satanic panic of the 1980s and how I believe it has affected us in modern history and in past history. So if that sounds interesting to you, stay tuned. And if you're new here, hi, I'm Em, and I welcome you to my channel. The year was 1989, and my dad was in Alaska for several months at a time because he worked on the big fishing boats. He was an engineer, and it was his job to make sure all the radar technology, all that stuff was working smoothly. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and she had my brother and newborn baby M to take care of at home. We lived way out in the boonies. We lived about 6 or 7 miles from town. Our closest neighbor was maybe half a mile down the road. We were surrounded by farmland. You look outside at night and you'd see some lights off in the distance, but there weren't a lot of lights. It was pretty dark out. We lived on the corner of two kind of main roads, but also kind of isolated and creepy at night. You definitely wouldn't want to be walking out there at night by yourself. It's very dark, it's very creepy, it's isolating. And did I mention creepy? This is 1989 again, so think about the times. We didn't have internet back then, we didn't have cell phones. We had a house phone, and we had the news, and we had a radio. That was it. That was our connection to the world. I remember my mom telling this story so many times where one night the hairs rose up on the back of her neck, and she just felt something was wrong. Like her stomach was turning. She didn't feel right. Something was wrong. She turned off the TV and was listening. And again, it was just her and my brother and I at home alone. Went to the window, looked out, and noticed some lights flickering in the distance. She stood at the door, opened it, and kind of listened out to hear if there was somebody out there. And she says that she heard chanting. Chanting would be really creepy in the middle of nowhere where you can't see a darn thing. There's no street lights, nothing. The hairs on her arms and her whole body were just sticking straight up, and she knew she needed to shut the door, lock it, make sure all the windows are locked and sealed with the sticks. Remember those big old sticks you'd stick in the window? I hope you're still doing that if you have like bay windows or glass sliding doors. But she went and she did all that. She went and made sure she had the key to my dad's gun cabinet because my dad hunted and he had a bunch of rifles and things, and she made sure that she had access to the guns just in case. But yeah, she heard chanting in the middle of nowhere in the 1980s. If you're a millennial like me, this kind of story may not be unheard of. You might have actually heard your own kind of story like this before from a family member, a friend, a distant cousin, or someone who lived out in the boonies. But it was not uncommon in the 1980s for people to have these mysterious encounters with these cult-like Satanists or people who did creepy things in the middle of the night, like animal sacrifices and things like that. Amplifying her fear was the fact that neighbors had reported that some of their chickens were missing or some of their pets were gone. And she would see these signs posted around the back road saying missing cat, missing dog, reward for missing chickens, someone stole her chickens, or someone stole her horse. Like, who steals a horse? But it was something that she saw. At the height of the 1980s, there was something called the Satanic Panic, which I think led into my mom's fears and exacerbated these fears even more. Who's to say that she didn't hear chanting and that there wasn't some weird ritual happening out in the middle of someone's cornfield? But it was very strange, but it was not an uncommon story. In 1980, there was a book written by a psychologist called Michelle Remembers. It ended up being like a New York Times bestseller. A lot of people bought this book and they bought into the hype. So the psychologist apparently details the recollections from this young woman named Michelle who revealed memories of being abused through rituals from satanic cult members. I haven't read the book, so I can't outline it, and plus YouTube doesn't like it when you outline like detailed graphic stuff. It was very clear that something bad had happened to this young woman, this girl growing up. What happened was she was abused by an apparent group of Satanists from Canada. Now, those two things don't quite mix together if you think about this trope of a Canadian being like the nicest person in the world with this idea and trope of what a Satanist is. But anyway, we'll kind of get my neurodivergent thought out of the way there. I just wanted to throw that out. This book was so popular that it kind of burned like a wildfire. This idea that children were at risk, and a frenzy ensued. This was kind of a cultural reckoning at the time. People just started noticing things about brands, about things in pop culture, like that thing is satanic because it looks like this, or if you do this and manipulate it in this way, then this sounds like a satanic message. But if you stop and play a tape backwards, of course it's going to sound weird, right?
You will be asleep in bed. I will be there.
But this is how people were thinking back then. It really spurred this fear of satanic cults. You know what's really interesting is that when you look at what a cult actually is and how we perceive them in pop culture, when we think of cults, maybe Satanism comes to mind immediately, maybe it doesn't. But when I think of cults, I think of things like Charles Manson and his followers. I think of the Church of Scientology and other kind of religious movements. But if you notice, one thing that they have in common is that they're not using Satan as a godhead figure. He is not the head of their cults. It's usually someone on the verge of some sort of mental breakdown and sensationalizing Christianity to a degree where they're following this leader into their own doom, into this belief that Jesus is coming soon, or it's apocalyptic times and we've got to do all these things and make sure we're prepared for when the world ends. But Satan isn't really the head of that. He's not usually the catalyst or the figurehead of these movements. Now, when you think of Satanism, what's actually interesting is most Satanists, people who identify as Satanists, don't have a religion. In fact, they're more atheist than anything. They don't worship Satan. They refer to themselves as Satanists because it's kind of a sensationalized claim to that word because it's so anti-establishment. It's very anti-authoritative. It's anti-religion. And we live in a world where religion rules a lot of our day-to-day lives, even if we aren't ourselves religious. We see it in politics all the time. Let's just leave it there. I had a friend in high school who identified as a Satanist. I didn't know until he told me that he was Satanist. And, back then, little old me was not very knowledgeable about the world. I was immediately like, does that mean you sacrifice animals and do weird things? And he's looking at me like, what? No. And he's like, I'm kind of like a libertarian. And I looked at him like, oh, okay. And he's like, I believe religion is bad. I believe that religion is a way to control people, and I'm anti-establishment, anti-this. We're not a believer or follower of this religious ideology or theocracy. And I thought, interesting, cool, okay, we're still friends even though I'm Christian, and I mean, we don't have to believe the same things to be friends, but I thought it was interesting. And I think it's something that needs to be shared because a lot of people have misconceptions on what Satanism is versus Satan worshiping. They're completely two separate things. I digress. Another neurodivergent. Let's go down a rabbit hole. Let's have a squirrel moment. Let's get back to topic. So throughout the 1980s, there were over 12,000 reports of abuse. The thing that really struck people and made them fearful was not so much about the worship and the weird rituals that kind of were creepy. It was more about the fear of what would happen to their children. So after the book, Michelle Remembers, was released, people started thinking about their children. What are my children experiencing? And they started looking for all these signs. Things that may not even existed. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're like, oh, well, this happened to this girl, so now I need to be on the lookout for this thing happening too. Over 12,000 reports were made against people throughout the 1980s accusing them of child abuse and being participants in some sort of Satanist ritualistic society or cult. In 1983, in a town called Manhattan Beach, California, teachers and staff at a school were accused of doing horrible things to children. And the police, thinking, okay, well, we have these accusations, thought it'd be a good idea to send out about 200 letters to people in the community asking them if their children had experienced any abuse and if they could come forward and share their experiences. Well, of course, we know that at this time, the book had already been out for 3 years. It was already a media frenzy. People are looking for these things. Of course, they're going to bring their kids in. They said that hundreds of children were brought in and interviewed for hours at a time. And that's like really traumatic to have to explain to a total stranger in a uniform who's authoritative, who carries a gun and a weapon, to be drilled by them because you don't know what kind of training they've had. Do they know how to work with children? But they're doing this to hundreds of children who supposedly have been abused by their preschool teachers or babysitters or nannies or whoever was within their sphere, asking them questions. And if you know anything about the kinds of questions a child is going to be asked, has anyone touched you down there? Has anyone looked at you weird? Has anyone touched you inappropriately? Like drilling these questions over and over again because you're trying to get down to the bottom of, were you hurt or not? And I've actually been through an experience like that where I was drilled by someone to see if I had been abused by another person. And as a child, that was so traumatic. Police sent out these 200 letters and it ensued in hundreds of children being interviewed. And it did bring about 7 accusations against people. By 1986, 7 employees were charged with hundreds of counts of molestation and conspiracy. Within a week of those charges being filed, 5 of these people had their charges dropped because of inadequate evidence. But 2 went on to be charged and their entire ordeal lasted for several years. Obviously, this kind of case would be heavily publicized, and it was. What's crazy is that in 1990, the 2 people whose charges remained were acquitted of most of the charges, and whatever charges a jury could not convict them of, it was due to being deadlocked. They couldn't agree. So the judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial. This had been going on for years at this point. It was a $15 million pursuit of justice, so the charges were dropped altogether. Because at this point, these people had already been through a public trial, and like they'd lost their jobs, their whole lives are upturned. But for what? They never got convicted. It was a waste of $15 million. Mind you, this was also a time when parents had to be reminded right before the 10 o'clock news, do you know where your children are at?
Do you know where your children are?
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
Because you wouldn't come home until the streetlights were on. And if you weren't home for dinner, it wasn't uncommon because you could have been at a friend's house, a family member's house, who knows? And again, no cell phones to track kids, no social media, no nothing. It was telephones. So this juxtaposition of people not caring where their kids are to being hyper-focused on all of these horrible things that could be happening to their children. Society was weird in the 1980s, man. It was very weird. People were always looking for things that corroborated this idea that their children were being harmed or that their children were involved with people who were unsavory at best. People accused neighbors and their teachers and people in their communities of these horrific things, and obviously we know how well trained these police officers are in these situations. Even police at that time would send out pamphlets or post flyers to tell people what kinds of symbols and warning signs to look for. And even companies like Procter & Gamble, who's a huge conglomerate, came under scrutiny for their logo or their trademark being a satanic message, even though their logo had been over 100 years old at that point and was reminiscent of the 13 colonies of early colonial America. But despite all that, they were accused of all these horrific things and blacklisted and boycotted, and it was nuts. They even had to file lawsuits to help protect their name, to protect their brand because of the logo and hysteria over it supposedly being the satanic symbol. I don't know, I'll let you be the judge of that. Does anyone know what this means? I mean, I just see a moon and stars, but that's just me. In the 1980s, all throughout the Satanic Panic, there were about 200 people who were charged with abuse. And what's crazy about this was that dozens of people were convicted and sent to prison. As the years have gone by, a lot of those convictions ended up being overturned and people were released. which is really sad if you think about it. That mass hysteria ended up losing people their freedoms. There were teenagers who are known as the West Memphis Three who were accused of murder through satanic rituals and sacrifices, and they were sentenced to prison, and they were released in 2011 after almost 20 years of being incarcerated.
I want to make some clarifications on this case specifically. These gentlemen were released from prison in 2011 due to multiple reasons. DNA evidence did not link them to the crimes. Also, during the investigation period, there were multiple chains of custody that were not followed for evidence. The police did not follow protocol or law in interviewing one of the suspects, as well as using intimidation and coercion to receive testimony from apparent witnesses. A lot of these stories faltered in the end, so all of this led to these three gentlemen being released early, having time served against convictions.
Could you imagine being a teenager and losing your youth because of this mass hysteria? Granted, there's some other things about the case that maybe I'll link below that you can look into yourself, but it's just crazy to see these three teenagers lost their youth over this. A Texas couple was imprisoned for 21 years and their conviction ended up being overturned entirely, and they won $3.4 million worth of damages. And I have to sit there and wonder, like, $3.4 million is a lot of money. But then you take out taxes and lawyer fees, and how much are they really left with? Probably about half of that, or maybe a little less than half. So maybe $1.5 million. Let's just say that. $1.5 million for two people to be incarcerated for 21 years. Even looking back in time and kind of recalculating based on inflation and wages back then, would you sell your life, or your husband or your partner or your wife, that maybe a sister or family member that you love dearly, would you trade your two lives for 21 years for $1.5 million? I have to wonder that, for a wrongful conviction. Prison's not an easy system to live in. I mean, it's not meant to be a vacation, so you're confined and restricted on what freedoms you have within prison, not being able to see your family members, your loved ones being taken away from society at large, not able to keep up with your skills so that when you do get out of prison, you might be employable. Just think about that. It's crazy to me that people lost decades of their lives over this. But what's interesting to me, though, is that it's not a new phenomenon. Every decade or so, or maybe every 20 years or so, our country encounters some weird cultural phenomenon where we end up in some sort of mass hysteria over one thing or another. And it's not even the US. Let's look at Nazi Germany, for example. The mass hysteria that led to fascism and this uprising of the Nazi way of thinking and how that spread, that was building up over time. It wasn't just an instant, like, let's just start this now, and it's just a flame or an explosion. But it's a build-up over time, and people cling to ideas that explain why things are the way they are, especially if it favors them being the victim. And it allows them to be the victim and hero in this story. And they can pass blame off onto another party and villainize another group of people. And I feel like we as a culture, we as a society, we as modern day people, as a collective, do this all the time. So the 1940s, 30s and 40s with fascism and the rise of some horrible things. If we look at the 1950s, McCarthyism, the fear of communism, and that led to a lot of conflicts and political movements and a lot of people being villainized, celebrities too. We move forward to cults that we're seeing in the 1960s and 70s with celebrity culture, Charles Manson and his family, so on and so forth, to the satanic panic of the 1980s. Even if we look in modern day history, we see conspiracy groups like QAnon and various things going on social media saying this political party is doing this thing and this political party is doing that and this is going on. Don't support this because they're actually really this. If you look at a company like Wayfair had accusations of supporting child grooming and all these horrible things, yet they're still in business and they're No one was accused, as far as I know, or convicted or anything. And even in things that are going on in our current news cycle with P Diddy and the horrific things he's being accused of, we see a lot of conspiracy theories popping up on TikTok and Instagram Reels, here on YouTube, with all the celebrities and all of the political leaders and all of these notorious people who supposedly went to these parties. It's becoming this huge thing where it's like, you can't trust any celebrity, they're all bad, they're all involved. I see a lot of patterns happening in things that we're seeing today, and I just wanted to highlight that. And just to have a real conversation about sensationalism, about panic, about hysteria, about willful ignorance, about all these things that lead people to make the decisions that they do. And also to serve as a reminder to be diligent in researching and uncovering facts for yourself, and not just taking something at face value, and not always believing the first thing you see on Facebook or in the news. Sometimes you have to dig a little deeper, and sometimes you have to look at multiple sources to see if something is actually truthful, if something is rooted in fact. And if it is, or if there are patterns to that, thinking about it critically. Why is this happening? Does this matter to me? Does this matter to my situation? How's that going to affect my community? How's that going to affect my children? Are my children going to have to deal with this someday? You know, thinking about it in that kind of critical stance, I think, helps to alleviate the stress to jump on the bandwagon. Let me know if you have any thoughts to add, or if there's anything that I missed, or maybe you experienced something where you have your own creepy tale of encountering cults or some sort of weird thing. Let me know. I would love to have a conversation with you in the chat, and I appreciate you for hanging out with me today, and hope you have an awesome, safe, and wonderful rest of your day. Have a good one. Mwah. Bye.